All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Chris Adams. I'm with Balancing Act. I'm one of the co-founders of the Balancing Act online budget simulation and suite of tools and approaches to budget engagement. And with me is the co-founder of Balancing Act, Brenda Morrison, who may be chiming in throughout the session. We're very excited to have this session. This is the first one that we've done that's specifically for elected officials. And we don't have just elected officials on the call. We also have some staff and others, which is just fine because one thing that we've learned about budget engagement is that it's a team effort and it really needs cooperation and participation from both professional staff as well as elected officials, and then obviously residents. So we're really glad to be able to have a learning series that's specifically devoted to the needs and role of elected officials on this. Let me quickly go over the agenda. Why isn't it moving? There it is. Okay, good. I hope it doesn't move more than once. Good. So in just a moment, I'm going to do just a little bit of an overview about just some of the urgency and reason why elected officials might be concerned about trust in government and having an engaged and informed citizenry. And then we'll talk just a little bit about in one of the crux questions, which is what is the goal of public participation? What are some of the issues? And then I'm very much looking forward to having two guest perspectives. We'll have Russell Neal, who is the Ward 4 councilman at the city of Akron, Ohio, and then we'll have Pearl Sangha, and as of yesterday, she was with the Office of the Mayor in San Jose, California. She has a new position as of today, and we'll let her explain that later. Pearl is also a former elected official in the United Kingdom, and for those of you who are aware, the United Kingdom and Australia and Canada are actually probably a little bit further ahead than the U.S. in terms of thinking about approaches and techniques and usefulness for budget engagement. So we're looking forward to having Pearl's perspective, not just from a large U.S. city in San Jose, but also from the United Kingdom, and also Councilman Neal's. And I know that Councilman Neal, he had a busy day today, and he's actually facilitating a meeting. He thought he'd be joining us at about 11 or in about 5 minutes. If for some reason he's not, then we'll just go to Pearl and maybe mix up the order a little bit. And then I want to just share a few thoughts and ideas that we've learned, both from the background research and the rationale for creating an online budget simulation, and also just looking at the larger issue of citizen participation in budgeting and understanding financial issues. And then we'll have a discussion, and very much looking forward to that. The promise of webinars is that you want it to be something highly interactive, but in some cases that's not the case. It's a little bit harder with the technological barrier, but I do hope that people will feel free to speak up. You should have a little bit of a control panel, which I think shows up on the right side of your screen. Please, if you have a comment or a question, there's a little hand icon. Click on that, and it'll do the equivalent of raising your hand, and then we'll see that, and then I can unmute you, and you can ask a question. You can also type a comment into the chat box, and I'll try to watch that. If Brenda is able, she might be able to watch that a little more carefully because I'll be focusing on the PowerPoint here. So let's go ahead and go forward with just kind of a high-level thought on why this is important to governance. And so this is a slide from the Edelman Trust, and it talks about trust in institutions. And it starts in 2012 and goes through 2016. And the one I want to draw your attention to is the one in this lower right-hand corner. And what this graph is telling us is that the blue graph is the level of trust that people have who are the general population. And what they found is that when people are informed, they keep up with the news, they participate in some way in civic events and thinking through governance issues, the type of people that would possibly want to be engaged on thinking through some budget decisions, that trust level goes from 43% to 51%, and that's very significant. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to accomplish by coming up with meaningful ways to participate online and also with some hybrid techniques face-to-face. Adding to that a little bit is a study from the Center for California Studies. And what this tells us is that when people are informed and engaged, and they have an index, and I can share the paper with you if you'd like, but they have a way of categorizing people as being either informed or uninformed, or engaged or disengaged. And if you look on the far left side here, you see the response, the number of people that have a belief that sales tax rate is too high when people are uninformed and disengaged, and it's over 45%. And as people move on the spectrum towards being more informed and engaged, it moves down to about 28%. And so the idea here and the hope is that by coming up with ways for people to learn about public decisions, public issues, that they will become more informed and more engaged, and will have more realistic expectations, and hopefully believe that their tax rates are appropriate for the services that are being delivered. That same study reduces what I call magical thinking. So in my definition, magical thinking is thinking that you can simultaneously have taxes decrease and services increase. And so the graph shows the probability of people thinking those two things simultaneously decreases from about 25% or 22% when people are uninformed and disengaged, and when people are actually paying attention and they feel like they're connected with the government, it shrinks to about, I think, 5 or 6%. So two fairly laudable things. Before we launch into some of the issues that I want to raise with folks, I just want to show a couple of pictures. This is a picture from a council meeting in San Antonio, Texas, and the man up in front there is a guy named Brian Layton, who is I think at that point he was the Director of Innovation for the City of San Antonio, and they did some very innovative things with getting residents involved in thinking through budget decisions and using simulations and a combination of face-to-face interactions and social media. They just did a terrific job with that and had some very successful outcomes. And then this picture is from just a few weeks ago in Kansas City, and it just shows people sitting around round tables, once again using an online simulation in a face-to-face setting, which we think is a very good practice, and going through some budget options and then talking about them both with their neighbors and also with the public officials. It looks like there's possibly a firefighter up on the top of the screen there. But this one was sort of a mixture of residents that volunteered to participate, and then city staff in Kansas City that were there sort of as subject matter experts and also to listen. So we're about to go into, and I don't see Councilman Neal on yet, so we'll probably go to Pearl first. I just wanted to identify some issues.
Yes, sir, I'm here.
So Brenda and I, oh, wonderful, thank you. Nice to hear from you, Councilman Neal. I'm going to introduce you in just a moment. I just wanted to share, as Brenda, my colleague, and I, as we go around the country and talk to both professional staff as well as council members, there's just a number of recurring issues that keep coming up. And so I thought I'd just put those on a slide and kind of just lay them out before we ask our two guest presenters to share their perspective, just to sort of add a little bit of the baseline. And I've told them that they can feel free to either speak to these issues or just to speak to whatever they would like to. But we consistently hear the issue and the desirability of transparency, of having people feel as though that they can learn about the government and what they're spending money on. There's the related goal of getting input on how to balance the budget, and what we found is that it's quite different depending on what the topic is or the condition is that is being looked at. So the first two are pain points. So pain point being tax increase, and what we found is that there does seem to be an awful lot of interest if there is a prospective tax increase that might be on the horizon, of getting some good, solid public participation and public input on that. Definitely a pain point on spending cuts, and in a few minutes after our two guest presenters talk, I'm going to share some research actually on how municipalities in the U.S. dealt with spending cuts after the Great Recession, and the difference between those cities that took a participatory approach and those cities that that didn't. And then there's the bright spot where the revenue projections are looking rosier than they had. There's an opportunity for some new spending and expansion. And one thing I'd actually love to validate and test with those of you on the call, we've heard professional staff say that that they think that elected officials have much more interest in getting input from the public on those pain points than they do on the bright spot. That when there is an opportunity for expansion, at least in their assessment, that it seems as though the elected officials like to think about, well, should we build a new rec center? Should we improve the conditions of our sidewalks and streets, et cetera? That there's a less of an interest in that. And I have not validated that perspective, but that's just one that's out there. It might be interesting to hear some of you talk about it. Next one is just going beyond the usual suspects. I'm sure that those of you who have held or hold elective office have gotten an earful on more than one occasion, probably from a lot of the same people. And so finding some ways to get around that and to reach some hard-to-reach populations. And then there's this sort of balance that we found between, what is most important if you are going to do budget engagement. Is it the input, the information that you get, and there's varying views on how valuable that is? Or is it just that you want people to have the opportunity to participate because you think in a democracy that there should be some openness and there should be an opportunity to have a conversation about these important issues about how tax monies are being spent and really what those tax rates are? Or is it roughly both? And I'll just give you a little trend example here. What we found informally is that the smaller the local government entity, they seem to be more interested in providing the opportunity to participate. And what we found from our larger entities is that they value the input more. So and it could be a staff function because they have larger staffs and they can sort of put those things, put together reports. But we have found a variation in size, and we don't know exactly what to make of that yet, or even if it's a solid trend, but that's just something I'll share with you all. And then obviously they're not mutually exclusive, so it could be both. So those are just some issues, and Councilman, if you want to speak to that, or Pearl, if you want to speak to these, you can. Otherwise, I've had numerous conversations with each of you, and I'd be very excited just to hear why you think this is an important issue. So this is just a slide with the two of them, Councilman Neal on the left and Pearl Sang-Ha on the right. So Councilman Neal, if you wouldn't mind just taking 5 or 10 minutes just to talk about why you think public engagement on the budget and having an informed citizenry is important to you and your leadership in Akron.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thanks to everyone on the call. I apologize, I'm not in front of a computer. I stepped out of a meeting. I just wanted to be able to share, as those know, one of the most important things that members of council do is oversee the budget for the city. And to have the input from the citizens is critical, I believe. Our city just passed a 0.25% income tax increase for infrastructure improvement. And one of the big questions that was asked by a lot of the citizens is there going to be transparency with the money? Will we have input? We haven't installed it yet, but will be installing Balancing Act based on what myself and one of my colleagues gleaned from when we went to the National League of Cities and sat through a course to understand how it actually works. And it's we do have open checkbook, but to have citizens' input on the budget is critical, because then we can capitalize on the intellectual capital that's out there in our community in helping us make the right decisions on where to invest their dollars. So I just wanted to be able to come on and hear from others, but also just to share how critical it is as part of our overall plan as a part of our open government strategic plan to engage our citizens in everything from the legislative process to the budget.
Thank you very much, Councilman. And I know your situation has changed since when we first started talking. More recently, your council has passed this 0.25% sales tax increase, and so there's some money to to allocate to other purposes. I remember speaking with you, I think earlier in the summer, when the council was contemplating the tax increase, and
yes.
I think you might have been a minority voice at that point. But you had expressed very, compellingly to me that you thought it was very important before asking people for a tax increase to have input. So not just on the spending side, but on the taxation side as well.
Oh, for sure. And as you can well attest, a meeting that was supposed to be 15 minutes with budget chair and the administration to get them familiar with the tool turned into an hour, and they were very much impressed. And like I said, that's why we're going to implement the program at that time. I think part of it was because it was new, and the focus was on trying to pass the levy. They wanted to wait till they got that pass to implement this part of the open government budgetary process. So, our budget chair was pulled into a meeting. He's not able to be on this call today, but he's on board. So we look to first quarter use it as a tool so that we can engage our citizens in helping us make the right investment of the the dollars that we have coming in now.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great, and we're happy that passed, and that you got this opportunity to have this conversation with your residents. So thank you very much. And I know that you said you might need to drop off, but please stay as long as you can and contribute whenever you want. But if you can't, then we understand and thank you.
Yeah, I'm gonna listen in. I'm gonna put my phone on mute so I can listen in. Thank you.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. Pearl, from the other side of the United States, in San Jose, one of the cities, one of the country's largest cities, and also in a hotbed of technology. What is your perspective, both from San Jose, but also from being an elected official yourself in the United Kingdom?
Hi. Well, thanks for the introduction, Chris, and also thank you for the stark reminder that I need to change my LinkedIn photo. We are so excited to be working with you, and there are just three things actually that I wanted to touch on that are sort of important to us, but also from the political side, things that I view as important and helpful moving in. You mentioned that I'm changing roles. As of today, I'm now the campaign manager for the mayor's reelection, which is really exciting. But there are three sort of points that tie into both the policy side and the City Hall side, but also the political side. So the first point, back in your first couple of slides, we saw you talk about the gap in trust. And for government, it was 51. I think the uninformed level was 43, right? And then it went up to 51 after we're talking about informed public. So that's a huge jump. That's a 7 or 8 point jump. And the one thing that I'd highlight from a campaign perspective, 7 or 8 points is something that can flip a seat. So if you're able to get buy-in, from your residents, especially, as the council members talking about the tax increase, and sort of implementing this program to bring residents in and on board. I think there's a huge opportunity there to get the right message out, get people involved democratically, but also, utilizing that additional aspect of, projecting the agenda that we want to project through an election campaign. So that's interesting. The other thing is, the transparency and the input and the usual suspects. I mean, that's honestly what my favorite aspect of the software is, that ability to reach out and get a wider set of opinions. It's the meeting mode is probably my favorite sort of tool that we're going to get out and use. Our staff team has been just talking about, the different forums we can do that in, and the fact that, people can really put their input in a live setting, and, to see the results in real time really opens up a conversation, right? It's hard to put yourself in the shoes of a politician when you're making tough choices, and at the same time, I think that politicos are able to look at residents and go, okay, what we thought was important to you, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, and having that sort of dialogue out in the public space, again, I think breeds transparency, but allows people to be brought on board in a way that, you know, we haven't really seen much of, in my opinion. So those are just a few points that I wanted to touch on.
Those are great. And what about public engagement on the budget in the UK when you're a council member? Why do you think that it seems to be a more common part of governance there than it is in the U.S.?
You know, it is. I think that's the case for a number of reasons. I think, first of all, the population is, you know, a slightly smaller. It is easier to get out and get involved with people. So I think that, you know, councils have been able to co-develop a strategy with the council staff and the politicians going out into communities. But the issues that you're facing in the UK are so there's an intensity that I don't think there is here in some respects. So, for example, when I was sitting on the council, we had a £75 million deficit that we had to find some way to cover it, and the choices were between things like social care for our elderly and subsidized housing for them. I think I mentioned too school lunches for children in communities that were extremely impoverished. In the city that I was in, we had 5 out of the 10 poorest postcodes, if you will, in the whole of Wales. So the poverty issues there were very, very real, and being able to go out into community groups and say, you know, this is what we're facing, you know, what should we do? What are your priorities? It really struck home the fact that difficult decisions are being made every day. And I think here there's a contrasting view, which is, you know, that willingness to pay persona, that idea that, you know, I will pay this amount and I max out here for basic public services. I think the approach is a lot different, and I think the challenges are greater, therefore, getting people engaged. So, yeah, there are differences sort of in the way that it's approached, but I think that the issues are there's an intensity there that makes you want to get out and just speak to people and inform them.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. And as I said, I'll touch upon this a little bit in later on about what it looks like to do public engagement in a contraction time. And unfortunately, the National League of Cities is projecting that. And you know, the Northern California and the Bay Area has a very strong economy, but we do work with a lot of cities and counties that are not in fortunate situations, and it's Hartford, Connecticut. Hartford, Connecticut was our first city that we worked with using our tool, Balancing Act, and they have a terrible structural deficit that's exacerbated by a number of things, including reduced funding from the state. So it's a big challenge. Well, thank you so much, Pearl, and please feel free to jump in whenever you want. And I was looking at the attendee list, and it looks like we have at least one person from Europe, I think from Holland. If you want to chime in with what public engagement on the budget looks like, if anybody wants to share your experiences, love to hear it. Just raise your hand. All right, let me go through just a couple of slides that I'll share with people, and then we'll try to make some time for more discussion if there is some. The purpose of this webinar is to think about what the needs and opportunities and resources are for elected officials in terms of budget engagement. We here at Balancing Act, we've been doing this type of work for about 20 years, and we've been offering a software package now for about 2.5 that we think is useful. But the software is only as useful as the ideas and the strategy and the people behind it. And so we've come up with a pretty simple rubric to think about in terms of strategy. And I do a webinar for budget staff and city manager staff and those types of folks that goes heavily in depth on this. You're welcome to join. The next one is on December 12th. But I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I'm really going to spend time on where I think the appropriate role is for elected officials to plug in with this, and that's on that far left side of identifying goals. And so it really is, I think, the critical part of this for elected officials is to think, what is it that you ultimately want? And so we have just a series of questions. The one that I found to be the most revealing is to just ask people, what do you wish your residents knew about your financial condition? And in a place like Colorado, where we are, what public officials often want their residents to know is two things. Is one, that we have a revenue limit that it goes up at a slower rate than the costs of the goods and services that government buys and uses to serve the public, and that we also have a requirement that in order to increase tax rates, that there has to be a vote of the people. So it's not something that local government officials, elected, have the opportunity to do. So it's very important to have a pretty broad understanding of if there's a crisis, to have that understanding not just reside with the 5 or the 8 or the 11 people on your council, but to have that be understood more broadly. And there's, I think, about 15 or 20 U.S. states that have that requirement. So that's very important. Sometimes there's a specific issue. We've worked with some entities that have been trying to deal with. I mean, the big ones are things like, legacy infrastructure issues where pipes or stormwater are decaying and that they need to be dealt with, and those are things that are somewhat opaque to the public. But there are ways of putting those into a question that can be visceral, like what percentage of our streets should have a pavement rating of A or B? Should it be 50%? And there's a budget element to that. Should it be 70%? There's quite a large bump that would go along with that. Should it be 90% that have that A or B reading? Those are ways that people can sort of understand, why is it that it costs so much to bring roads and sidewalks up to a certain level, or even things like hours for libraries or rec centers. There's a cost associated with those, and you can actually frame those as policy questions that can be costed out, and people can really understand and wrestle with that and help you as elected officials think about how to balance those. That third point I sort of already raised in my previous slides. I won't go over that. And then we've got sort of a variety. We just started working with the City of Pittsburgh that is, at least in our view, in our experience, is the first one to do both an operating version of their budget simulation and to do a capital version, which we found to be really interesting. I think they'll be launching in the next couple of weeks here, and if you follow us on our email blast or on social media, you'll see it. I'm kind of excited about it. And then they pulled it together with a bit of a hybrid, and they did taxpayer receipt. And for those of you who can stay on until the end, I'll do a little bit of a demo of taxpayer receipt that combines the two. So they've taken the operating budget and sort of the 1-year cost of funding their capital plan, and they put it into a taxpayer receipt, and people can estimate their sales and property taxes and see how much they're paying for the goods and services, and also for the longer term projects. And then I've already touched upon this last one too, about are you trying to get people ready to vote on something? Are you seeking bonding authority? Are you seeking an increase in taxes? Something like that. This can be a really powerful way to do that. All right, let me move on. This is something that some of you might be familiar with. It's a pretty well-known tool, and I've taken just a part of it, but it's called the IAP2 Spectrum. And I found this to be a useful way to help both staff and elected officials think about what is their goal. And so it's pretty simple, really. They without making them evaluated. There's not a judgment about whether the left side of the spectrum is necessarily better than the right side. It's really what's most important. And so there's this idea of informing, and so providing people this opportunity to learn and to just kind of see what's going on. And transparency initiatives would fall under that, but also providing some type of an interactive model as well. Consulting moves it up a bit, where you're trying to get a little bit of a feedback, but not a terribly rich interaction. And involving is working a little bit more directly. And Pearl mentioned earlier a tool that we have, sort of a feature of our budget simulation called Meeting Mode that allows, it really makes what is an online simulation, it makes it possible to use it in face-to-face interactions. And those pictures from Kansas City that I showed you in the outset, those were taken of people in that city using Meeting Mode. But it's a good way to sort of start a conversation. And then moving to collaborate and empower. And I'll just tell you, even as somebody who's been doing public engagement for more than 20 years now, there's very few instances where you actually, want to fully empower residents to make governance decisions. And I would even say, right off the top of my head, I'd say you really never want to do that if you believe in representative democracy. But then I was reminded that, especially when it comes to tax policy in many of these states that we've been talking about, like California and Colorado and some others, that the legislature and the legislative function, the council, is not empowered to raise tax rates. And so essentially the residents are. And so effectively by the way the law is written, residents are empowered. And so if they're going to be empowered, it's important that they have good information and a good way of understanding what it might mean, for example, to do a 0.25% sales tax increase, and see what that might mean both on the tax burden side, but also what it might be able to pay for. And some of the sort of dire decisions that Pearl was talking about having to make when she was on City Council in the United Kingdom, those are some pretty important things, and people need to understand that that's what tax money could be paying for. And there's a choice point about whether or not it's going to be funded. And at least in my view, my hope is that that would make a compelling case for that type of public investment. We've got this is a slide from me where I've just sort of taken that same framework along the top in the yellow up there, the inform, consult, etc., and talked about how public engagement might look for each of those goals in terms of using an online simulation and face-to-face. And so we found that online simulations are great for especially the two on the left, informing and getting that high level of input. Would I like to see more of this type of item? Would I like to see a little bit more spending on police patrol? Would I like to see a little bit less spending on recreation centers or whatever? And then as you get to involve, collaborate, and empower, that's where the interaction takes place, and that's where we see a role for face-to-face interactions as well. And as Pearl was saying, the meeting mode, that adaptation to the online simulation can be a really powerful way of doing that. And I'm going to share this slide with you, so I'm not going to go over it too much. It violates the rules of PowerPoint by having too much information on it, but I just wanted to sort of share this with you, and hopefully it might be useful at some point. And then at the bottom, there's something that I'll also talk a little bit about later called taxpayer receipt. As I was mentioning for the city of Pittsburgh, it sort of goes hand in hand with their simulation. It can be a very useful way to provide relevant transparency and accountability. I did taxpayer receipt for a group of budget officers, and I'll just say they were a little chilly at first. They didn't like this idea. I'll show it to you in a moment, but it actually asks you a couple questions about yourself that are non-identifiable or non-identifying. And then it estimates the taxes that you pay that are usable by local government. And it was interesting. They at first these budget officers were uncomfortable with it, and then they went through the effort and they kind of got a little smile on their face, and they said, you know what? I think we actually do a great job with taxpayer resources, because it showed that I think you all probably get criticized all the time for spending vast amounts of money on administration and bureaucracy, and like often you'll see that the cost of a city manager per person per year is something like $1.75, and so even if people wanted to cut out that layer of what they would see as bureaucracy, that's not going to have any meaningful impact on the budget when you take that $1.75 and cost it out over a year. So it can be a useful thing. I've got for those of you who can stay on a little bit longer, I've got an example from the city of Denver that I'll show you. They just went public with theirs not too long ago, and they did a nice job with it. This one, I mentioned that the National League of Cities is forecasting not good fortunes in general for cities, and I hope that that's not the case for any of the folks who are on the call right now. But there's been quite a bit of research done actually on the difference between doing public engagement on the budget when you've got a surplus or a booming economy versus having some tight constraints, and it really does look somewhat different. This is a statement from just about 2 months ago, just saying that things are looking downward. This is a survey of budget officers and looking at revenue forecasts and things like that. And even though the national economy is doing quite well, there are some real problems in terms of how local government is funded. We've got 2 counties now, one in Arizona, and then one that's actually very close, just over the Four Corners region in Colorado, that are both struggling with the impacts of declining energy prices. They're places that are energy rich, and they've been doing quite well actually when energy prices were doing well, but in the last several years with the decline in energy prices, they have just their budget has just been decimated. And they're taking the approach that they need to that's a big enough issue that they need to have some fairly good buy-in and understanding from the residents, and so they're trying to educate people about it and possibly make some change. The county that's in Colorado, they've got that same constraint of not being able to change tax rates, so they can't really do anything else except make cuts with this declining revenue source unless they get public buy-in for it. So we're actually going to feature the public affairs officer from that county on our December 12th call, talking about why it's important that people understand this when revenues need to change. Another one that I hear all the time is Amazon and the effect that Amazon is having on local governments in a lot of places where even if it's a place where, even if you're in a state where Amazon pays a state sales tax, if you have that in your revenue mix, most of the time that the local government will not get the sales tax that it would have gotten if purchases were made in bricks and mortar stores within the city or the county. So things change, and having an ability to have a conversation with people is a pretty critical thing. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because it actually sets up the next one, but it's just looking at the study of how cities handled retrenchment after the Great Recession. And so it's by a guy named Benedict Jimenez from 2013. And the upshot of what he found is that about 25% of cities took active engagement roles in terms of explaining to their residents what was going on, and that revenues were down and that some hard choices need to be changed. And what they found was that and he dubbed that those 25% of cities the participatory ones. And what he found was that they just had greater flexibility. So this is a direct quote. It says, in participatory cities, nothing is off the table when dealing with a fiscal crisis. And so hopefully that wouldn't just be with a fiscal crisis. It could be when you're envisioning and dreaming big thoughts. But this idea of having this meaningful, it doesn't need to be terribly robust all the time, but having this meaningful relationship with residents about what financial conditions and what dreams and aspirations might be, or what some of the incredibly hard choices might need to be. When you take these participatory measures, you actually have a lot more flexibility. This next one is just a question. What type of input do elected officials need? And at least my thoughts from doing this over and over again and looking at some of the research is that you need people to understand what the real trade-offs are. There's this quote is about, in some ways, the limited usefulness. I was going to say something stronger, but the limited usefulness of surveys in terms of providing information to decision makers about budget preferences. And the problem is that they don't have any constraints, and usually they don't attach costs. And so these guys, these 2 scholars, Mark Robbins and Bill Simonson, are big proponents of using simulations as a way to to get to what they call sincere preferences or that willingness to pay. So it's not just enough to do a survey because who doesn't love parks, pothole-free roads, highly efficient fire department that can have $1 million piece of equipment at your residence in 6 minutes, and those are all wonderful things, and no one's going to be against those. But if you were to put the same constraints both on available revenue and also competing needs, the same things that you all have to do as you make a budget, people look a lot different. It looks a lot different in terms of the inputs that they give. And there's been, I talk to both professional staff as well as elected officials all the time, and there's often this reluctance to say, I'm not sure people can handle that, or will they act responsibly? And it's been our experience that people absolutely do, and that it's when sort of given the information that that they can provide some really good input that actually might be useful in terms of coming up with some of those hard choices that were mentioned on the previous slide, especially with dealing with a downturn. This is sort of a follow-on to that. These researchers, Carol Abdon and Amy Franklin, they talk about willingness to pay, and so it's kind of that same point that we don't have that good information, and this was from 2006 before. There's several companies that offer online budget simulations, including ours, but these online budget simulations, especially when you can use them both online and in face-to-face settings, they can actually really engage people in thinking about that willingness to pay and the sincere preferences. And I think there's really a large opportunity with that. And we're doing some work with GFOA to sort of articulate this a little bit better because we think it's a very positive thing. Let's see. And then this last one is just a piece of research that I ran across about how electeds work with staff to get the engagement they want. And I know I talked to Councilman Neal. I don't know if he's still on any longer, but sometimes there's what we've come across as this sort of two-step where you talk to council members and mayors, especially in smaller cities. A place like San Jose is different, but places that have a little bit more typical council manager type of government or something along those lines. Is that council sort of says, yeah, I'd kind of like that, but we don't really have the wherewithal to pull this off, and staff are kind of like, well, we think this is sort of cool, but it's not really our job to do this. And so this quote just captured that, I think, very nicely. This is from a series of focus groups with local government CFOs, and the upshot is that the CFOs were just say that that they don't want to risk the conflict because they're not the elected official. They don't want to risk the conflict they face by assuming this role as representative of the people. They want it to be initiated, or at least to be, the case to be made by elected officials that this is something that we need to happen. So they say CFOs say that they should not be the formal initiators of citizen participation efforts. However, once convinced of elected officials' sincerity about participation, as well as their practicality, so the how, they are more than willing. And we found that as well, but we found that there's really not a good conversation among elected officials and professional staff about how to work together in doing that. One city manager did tell us, they said, if I had 2 or 3 city manager, or excuse me, if I had 2 or 3 council members telling me that I needed to do this, I would certainly do it. But right now, I'm not so sure I want the risk. And so I think that if there is this effort, this interest on behalf of electeds in having both this input and having this participation, it's something that needs to be communicated, because I think that they want to do their job in a robust way and they want to be helpful to you. It's something that I think could be quite useful. All right, and then I think at this point we're back to that discussion. This is a duplicate of the slide I had up earlier. I just thought I'd put it up and pause here and see if anybody wants to make any comments, either Pearl or Councilman Neal or my colleague Brenda or any of the attendees. If you have any questions or comments or want to challenge something or something that is important to you that we've missed. As I said, this is the first time we've done this particular webinar. So if you're one of the attendees, go ahead and raise your hand. And I think that the staff, I think that you're unmuted. So please feel free if you'd like to say anything. Maybe I'll just go ahead and unmute the participants as well. Pardon me? Is that you, Pearl?
Yeah, I was just saying, it's been an interesting webinar, and thanks for having me on. And I'm still here. If anybody has any questions, happy to stay on the line for a bit.
Good. All right. Anybody else want to add anything? If you do, please feel free. If you don't, I have a couple more slides I'm gonna show that they're pretty basic, and then I'm gonna do a quick demo of taxpayer receipt. So let me go ahead and I'll move to that, but I'll watch to see if there are any hands up. That's one of the frustrations, as I was saying before. You think these webinars are going to be these great interactive tools, but in some ways they're not as good for discussion. And that's just kind of the way it is. Oh, and it looks like Shanna from Michigan, I believe a city council member in East Lansing, if I'm remembering correctly. I think we've talked before. She is asking the question, how can you get elected officials to see the value in these engagement efforts when time, money are tight, and it feels like another thing to do or another expense? So, Pearl, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. One of the things that we have rolled out in San Jose, which it started before I sort of joined the team, but the woman that sort of spearheaded it from our office specialized in budget engagement, participatory budgeting. And essentially what the mayor agreed to do was give every council district a pot of $200,000. And in order to receive this money, you as a council person had to go through a process of participatory budgeting. So they played budget games. They went to neighborhood associations around their council districts and essentially did an information gathering exercise where they sort of went around for feelers just to see what sort of issues would come up. They collated everything and they came up with a list of priorities and then went back around to neighborhood associations again to say, this is the list, what's your input, come to this meeting and we're going to vote. And, the residents sort of ranked what they felt were important. And in some council districts, they were different issues. In one of them, it was about traffic calming measures in a busy downtown neighborhood. In another one, there was an increase in burglaries. So the residents agreed to install cameras at certain junctions of their neighborhoods. But that $200,000 pot really was the incentive to get people to buy in and have a say, but also to convince the council members that this is worth doing. And of course, and again, from that political side, if you're a council person, you have an interest in staying in your seat. You want to make sure that you're hearing everybody and you're doing something about it. So I think the buy-in from the council member goes in twofold. First, that ability to engage with your residents on that sort of local level, and two, you're following through with something that they've asked you to do because you have that pot of funding there. So I realize it's different in different places, but sort of having that incentive was really important. I hope that sort of was a good example and helped to answer the question.
No, that's great. And there's a related field. So what we do here is sort of whole budget public engagement. So the big picture, the official budget of the local government, and then what you're talking about is participatory budgeting, which is sort of a different but a close cousin. And the interesting thing about that is really high satisfaction. Residents love it. It's got a fairly high staff load. Each council member generally has to have a staff person that spends quite a bit of time on it, but it's really good outcomes, and we actually think very highly of that. Shannon, one thing I would say, go ahead, Pearl, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, going through that process over the last 2 years has allowed me to come forward with this software, and there's been no
right.
So that's sort of where I was going. I feel like you do have to start smaller, and you know that it is a close cousin, but I feel like that may be the way to go if that's sort of the issue that you're facing. But go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, and there's often there's kind of three types of work that can be done in budget engagement, participation, transparency. There's the true transparency stuff, like a company called OpenGov and Socrata. They have checkbook online, that type of thing, and that's really transparency. But sometimes people think that's a little bit of engagement, but we don't really think that so much. And there's participatory budgeting, which takes a small sliver of the budget that's usually attached to a council member, and it's almost like a block grant that can then go through this really hopefully robust process to decide how to spend it, what would be the most important local way to spend something, and it often comes up with the creative ideas, just like you were talking about. And what we found is that there's a real nice interplay between those two and what we do. They sound a little bit the same, and some people lump them together, but they're really different, and they do different things. But Shannon, to go to your question just a little bit about how can you get elected officials to see the value of these engagement efforts when times when you're tight, and it might just feel like another thing to do. I'll just tell you, some anecdotes. I mean, we have a number of terrific elected officials and professional staff who just think this is the right thing to do. And there's a woman, she was the budget director at Virginia Beach, who says, I view my role as being a steward of the people's money, and we absolutely need to have a way for them to understand what we're spending this money on, and for them to provide some informed input. I mean, there's just an article of good governance to her. We have a number of people like that, especially that sentiment is, I think, broadly shared among a lot of the elected officials that we come across. And so that's sort of on the positive side, and all the professional associations, ICMA and GFOA, they all recommend it. National League of Cities recommends robust civic engagement. So they're doing it because it seems like it's the right thing. But then to dig a little bit deeper on that, and why when I sort of prepared my slides for this talk, I didn't spend too much time focusing on Fort Collins, Colorado, which starts the budget each year with a $10 million surplus. And they do this type of work because they just see it as being important and appropriate to them doing their job well. But more often we find people coming to us when there's a constraint. So it's in a city in California where the needs for goods and services has outpaced the current revenue structure, and they can't change the revenue structure without a vote of the people. We get that all the time, and so they said, well, it'd be really nice if our city council could just do this on their own, but they can't, and so therefore we need to invest in this public engagement. So that's sort of one part of it. And the other part is when you get to pain points. So under that input on balancing the budget, the first two, pain point tax increase, pain point spending cut. We often find that when there are those pain points that elected officials want to share the pain. More broadly, they don't want to be just the ones that are raising your taxes or just the ones that are closing the libraries on you. And so there's a much higher likelihood, I think, among elected officials and professional staff in those tough times to want to do this. And so that would sort of be my response. And I don't know if you anything else, Sean, or did that answer your question? Or maybe I just ask you because. As I remember our conversation, you also worked at the Minnesota Municipal League. And I'm going to unmute you. I don't know if you're able to, if you have a microphone or not. But if you want to just ask, you can, or you can type anything, or we can just move on.
I'm good, thanks. That's helpful. I think all of those are very helpful, and I'm involved in the Michigan Municipal League, and this is an issue a lot of our communities deal with as well. So it's, I think intellectually people sort of know, yes, we should do this. It's just when you get into that tight time and staff and electeds both get sort of like, well, it's another thing, it's money to spend, there's a public perception of that. So I think it's the value proposition that's sometimes the challenge. But we're trying to get at it.
Right, and I think you're right, and I would actually be I'm pretty understanding of that. Sometimes you just have to prioritize what you do with limited time and resources. But I can also say that we've had a number of entities that have, even when times are good, they want to invest in having a two-way vehicle for informed communication because they know that times aren't always going to be good. And so, I completely get that you may want to, that there's other things that take priority, or, if you are looking at doing something in the budget area that, it might be the right time to do participatory budgeting, which is pretty staff intensive, but it has, some specific benefits. Or you might want to work on some transparency or checkbook online or something like that. So this isn't the be all end all, the sole solution, but I think for certain types of leaders and leadership, I think it's critical. And in certain conditions, I think, I'm not an elected official, but I would, if I were looking at doing some tax increases or making some spending cuts, I would absolutely want there to be a robust public process where people had a chance to provide some input. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And
right.
I think it's important in both times, good and bad.
Yeah, I do too. I do too. So anything else? Go ahead and raise a hand or ask a question or whatever. And if not, I'm just going to sort of close this out here. There are two related tools, and as I said, this was meant to be about budget engagement in general and not about specific tools, but two things that we do that we think is sort of useful, especially to elected officials, is we have this thing called meeting mode, which Pearl had talked about, and we've got a number of cities, both big and small, that use it for their public meetings, and it's just a really interesting way to get people talking about the budget. And my favorite quote is from this guy named Adam Blom, and he was the facilitator of the meeting that you're looking at in Kansas City, and he says, the amazing thing is that residents are almost silent as they go through the exercise because they're concentrating so hard on making these decisions. He said that they didn't talk for 10 minutes, that the room was just silent. And I think that sort of, should, for people who think that residents wouldn't take this seriously, I think that would sort of, dispel that myth. We've also had it used in not just big meetings like this. We've had it used in, for community advisory boards, citizen academies. We even had a few city managers that have done it just for a small group, just for the city council budget retreat, because in some ways it helps to sort of focus not on a specific line item, like should we have, 7 FTE or 8 FTE, but to look a little bit more functionally and maybe at a level that's, probably more appropriate for policymakers. Let me just show you quickly what this looks like. I'm not going to go through a whole exercise showing you what it looks to demo it, but just to show you, this is City of Virginia Beach, and it's called the facilitator view. So the idea is that you give people who are attending a meeting a special URL, and then whatever the people who have that special URL say in that meeting, there's a special facilitator version, and it shows you what people, it shows you their results. And the nice thing about this is that you can then have a conversation about it. And so in this case, it's the fire department, and people have generally wanted to increase it. But it could be that, you might have a fire, department official there who could say, we're actually doing pretty well. We've got a 7-8 minute response time, and, I'm not so sure that that's the best thing. Or they could have a conversation about police patrol, and that might lead to, a conversation about, is it better to spend money on street lighting and midnight basketball, or is it more important to, hire more police officers? But those are the types of conversations that you can only get face-to-face. But if you can have a way of grounding it in reality and have some relative costs, it can be much more useful. So then the last thing I want to show you is taxpayer receipts. So this is City of Denver. This is their version in Spanish, which is kind of cool. And then this is their version in English. And so this page is the revenue estimating page, and this one we have to do custom for each. And actually, the software will allow you to create it yourself on the back end by about March. But right now, we do a little interview with you to figure out what are your revenues. So in this case, Denver wants the main resident-facing revenues are sales tax and income tax. And so we worked with an economist to come up with a way of estimating sales tax. I'm just going to put in your annual income. I'm going to put in $50,000, and then aid, I'll just go ahead and put in 35. And so what this is doing is it uses the Consumer Expenditure Survey to say somebody at this level of income has X amount of disposable income, and a 35-year-old buys X market basket of goods, some of which are sales taxable, some of which are not. And then it says, okay, that's how much they spend on goods and services, and it multiplies it times the sales tax rate, that only the sales tax rate that goes to the city. And then down here, because if somebody makes a purchase in Colorado Springs, but they live in Denver, the purchase, the sales tax revenue from Colorado Springs is not usable in Denver. So this says, well, how much do you actually spend in the city where you live? Let's go ahead and put in 80. And then we'll go down here and say, do you own a home? And so I'm going to put in 300,000. And because they want the actual value, we can also do assessed value, market value. We can whatever makes sense to put here. We just make a distinction. We just change the calculation on the back end, and then you go to view your tax receipt, and then it creates something that looks kind of like a grocery receipt, and it shows what you spend your money on. And this particular one has a lot of complexity on the back end. Most of them are pretty straightforward, but for example, in Denver, there's some special mills that only pay for affordable housing, and in this case, for that not atypical person that I just put in, they're paying $15.35 for their affordable housing. $12 of it is for their housing mill, so or for the special mill levy. So I'll just kind of scroll down here. Look at this, like city council. $3.07. So if anybody says that the great salaries of elected officials are what's causing a budget crisis, you can put the lie to it on this. Mayor's office, 83 cents. Down here, public safety, fire department, police department are actually fairly big because they've included pension payments. There's a special mill that just goes to fire and police pensions. And then you scroll on down, and you see that this person is paying both property and sales tax about $1,200. And you click here, get a breakdown, and then if Denver would have wanted to, they could have then had a link to their simulation and say, well, did we get the priorities right? How do you think we might want to, make changes to spending and revenue? So anyway, that's sort of all I was going to share with you guys. Any last comments from anybody? Well, thank you. Thank you especially to Russell Neal from Akron, Ohio, and to Pearl Sangha from San Jose, California. We wish you good luck in your campaign, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. I will make this available. We can make a recording of this available if you want to share it with colleagues, and I can also, if you'd like, make my slide deck available. So thanks everyone for participating, and let us know if you have ideas that we could have had to improve this, or things you'd like to cover, or if you want to learn any more about what we're doing. So thanks everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Chris. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.